1. This is the second to last chapter. This is chapter 3. And this is actually chapter 3 and 4. This is going to be our unit on ecology. And this is a lot of stuff that you learned in previous years, especially last year, but we're going to quickly go over what ecology is. Ecology, this is just the interactions of organisms to one another and their environment. We specifically look at how mankind interacts with the Earth, and you can see, yeah, we're not treating our Earth very well in just in general. So we're going to learn we learned a little bit about that with climate change, but we're going to see more about that in this chapter. So what's the difference between biotic and abiotic? Biotic factors are anything that's living. That includes once living organisms. Think bio meaning life. And then abiotic factors, these are factors that aren't living. Think A in front of the biotic means without. So think abiotic, not living, biotic, living. And that's all for 3.1. It's a very, very short section. These are terms that you should probably remember from previous or classes. Producers, these are organisms that convert light energy into chemical or organic compounds. These are plants. These are also that are like the phytoplankton in the sea, but we more think of just plants in general, just because it's easier. But yeah, plants. Consumers, these are organisms that eat other organisms for food. So these are like us humans, anything that eats things for food. These are also called autotrophs and heterotrophs, things that we've talked about before. Herbivores, these are organisms that only eat plants. Omnivores, these are organisms that eat both plants and other consumers. And carnivores, these are organisms that only eat meat or other consumers. You can see all three are consumers. I know I'm kind of going through this really quickly, but these are terms that I think you should probably know by now. Decomposers, these are organisms that break down waste of other materials and other organisms when they die off, so like worms, bacteria, fungi, and bugs. These are our decomposers. Good memes. All right, energy transfer. So let me go back. A food chain. This is just one linear series of feeding relationships. The arrows show the movement of energy. So you can see from plants, it goes to the crayfish, to the frog, to the alligator. That's one food chain. A food web is all of the food chains interconnected. So a food web is many food chains. And then all of those will then point to the decomposers because they will get decomposed at some point. The sun is the primary energy source for all the producers. So the sun initially gives the energy to the producers, and then that energy will make its way up to the different levels. So you have your producers that are eaten by our primary consumers. So think this in sequential order: primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. Just a refresher here: producers are eaten by the primary consumers. The primary consumers are eaten by the secondary consumers. The secondary consumers are eaten by the tertiary consumers, and the quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. Good. Okay, so energy transfer, like we talked about a little bit more, 10% rule. So the 10% rule states that 10% of the energy is going to be available for the next level. This is because a lot of that energy is lost in metabolism as in the form of heat. So if we have like 1,000,000 joules of sunlight coming to a certain area, only 10,000 or 10% of the light energy will be converted for the primary producers. Then 10% of that will be there for the primary consumers. And then you can see 10%, 10%. So you can see there's a lot of energy here at the bottom, but not a lot of energy here at the top. And that's just called the 10% rule. And that's the end of chapter 3. All right, chapter 4. This is our second chapter within the ecology unit. This looks more on ecosystems, and we show how ecosystems are going to be organized in this first section. So again, these are some terms that you should probably already understand, like organism. This is just one individual animal, plant, single life cell, whatever, one living thing. Population, we've already talked about populations. These are a bunch of organisms in the same area, same time period. Community, this is a group of different organisms. So it's not just one species, it's many species. This does not include the abiotic factors. So this could be like the prairie dogs, the whatever these species are, like the grass, that's a community. Ecosystem, now we're adding in all of the abiotic factors. So it's all the living and non-living things. Now, the roles within a community or an ecosystem that a species plays is called a niche or a niche, however you want to say it. The factors that could be influenced by an organism's niche is like habitat, predator-prey relationships, behaviors, energy consumption, energy usage. There's a lot of factors that go into the niche of an organism, but that's just the role it plays within that environment. Keystone species. These are species that exert a really dominant control over a community, and without them, you're going to see just disruption in that ecosystem. As you can see here, the sea otter is very important to this community. Without it, the sea otter keeps the sea urchins in check. So you can think of the keystone, kind of like the Keystone State of Pennsylvania. Without that keystone, everything else just falls apart. Invasive species. These are species that are non-native to a specific area. They get transferred usually by humans, and then they wreak havoc in that area, and they cause a lot of ecological and economic harm to that area. So these are invasive species that are not natural or not native to a specific area. Biodiversity. This is the variety of life or the variety of species in a particular habitat or ecosystem. More diversity equals a stronger ecosystem. We can see higher diversity, it means more life, lower diversity, lower life, and higher diversity is a much better ecosystem to have because again, it can adapt to different changes in the environments as well. All right, 4.3. These are symbiotic relationships. These are just relationships between two species. And there's a couple of different types of symbiotic relationships as we can see here. Our first type is mutualism or mutualistic symbiotic relationships. These are relationships where two organisms benefit, both of these organisms benefit. So like in the case of the flower and the bee gets nectar from the flower, but then the flower uses the bee to reproduce. Parasitism. This is when one organism benefits and one organism is negatively affected. You can see the examples here like mosquitoes and ticks. They just cling on to a certain organism and they use it for food at the expense of the host. Predation. Obviously, we know about predation. We have our predator-prey relationship here between the T-Rex and the human. This is just when one organism eats another. Commensalism. This is when there is a positive relationship with one organism, but the other organism doesn't really benefit at all. The barnacles on this whale are benefiting because they get a free ride and free transportation for meals. The whale here doesn't get anything. It's not really affected. It might be a little affected from the weight, but not really at all. All right, our last section here, this is the biome section. This is just our major ecosystems that we're going to see within the biosphere. There's a bunch of different terrestrial ecosystems and there are a bunch of different aquatic biomes as well. Oh, you live in the temperate forest biome. We won't specifically go over each one in here. I might have you for class go over like individually one of them and then see other ones because I think you've seen this stuff before. But one last term I want to get to before we close out this chapter is the difference between weather and climate, which we talked about before in climate change. But weather is just the day-to-day conditions. This is like heat, dryness, sunshine, rain, temperature, things like that. Climate is the averages of weather. So weather is more day-to-day, climate's longer periods of time. You can see the different terrestrial biomes. We'll probably go over those in a little bit. Oh, and lastly, biosphere. This is the broadest level of classification. This is just all of the ecosystems of the Earth. So now we're at the largest level of classification. And we're done.